the ecology and the metabolism is very complex, right? So it leads to a lot of questions around what's really happening. All right, so from a high level, just to remind us, how are we removing phosphorus? So when we see phosphorus coming in, it's soluble, it's colloidal, it's particulate. All we're trying to do is push the soluble and colloidal stuff, that stuff that's dissolved, into solids, then settle those solids from the liquid stream, and then your water is clean. Right? So at a base level, that's how we think of it as operators, as engineers, is that, we want to push this phosphorus into particulate and settle it out. And so the organisms that do that must be really interested in phosphorus, right? So when we nitrify, the organisms that remove ammonium are using the ammonium as their food source, right? When we have heterotrophs, they're using the BOD as their food source. We have this mentality of, okay, the thing that we're trying to remove, that's the food that these bugs are using to grow. All right? That kind of, anybody buying that? All right. So then when we think about PAOs, right? What did PAO stand for? Anybody remember what PAO stands for? Right. So what do we think that they're growing on? Okay. And that's why sometimes it's hard to understand, like, why they have this metabolism. Like, it's like, why do they do this with phosphorus? Why do they release phosphorus and take it up if they're growing on phosphorus? Right? It doesn't quite make sense. And the reason it doesn't make sense is because we have to shift our mindset and stop being so myopic and worry about what we want to do and think about what the organisms want to do. And the PAO organisms are really BOD storage organisms, right? The phosphorus is just like their side hustle, right? The BOD is what they really care about. So when we look at what's happening under anaerobic conditions, a lot of times we focus on this phosphorus piece, right? And it's like, they have this poly piece stored up, and then they release phosphorus under anaerobic conditions, right? And then we say, in the aerobic conditions, they're storing that phosphate. Really, what PAOs, why they're unique, is that they've developed the ability to store BOD and then grow with it. They're not growing on phosphorus. They grow on BOD. Right? So why do they do the things that they do? And when we think about it from strictly a phosphorus paradigm, it doesn't make any sense, right? Like, why would they develop this weird cycling of phosphorus if they're growing on phosphorus? But the reason that it does make sense is that phosphorus just enables them to have a unique ability to utilize BOD. All right, so when we get under anaerobic conditions and we have a bunch of volatile fatty acids, the PAOs are able to take that volatile fatty acid and store that in this PHA, which is just like an internal storage compound, right? So it's like at break or before, like you went out there and you consumed a donut, right? Right? Did you grow with that donut right away? Maybe you swelled a little bit, but did you grow? No, right? You get that in your stomach, and then you come in here and you aerobically process what you just put in your body, and that's where it grows. That's where you actually take in the calories and grow. And so that's the unique aspect of PAOs, is that most of our bacteria are just like, I see ammonium, I'm eating and growing on it, right? It's just like an instantaneous reaction that occurs. But with PAOs, they say, if there's VFA, I'm going to store that a little bit under anaerobic conditions, so that when I do get to aerobic conditions, I can bring in oxygen, bring in nitrate, and actually break that carbon compound down and grow. Right? So Russ, why do they do what they do when they get into storage tanks? It's because when you put them in a blend tank, what is there a whole lot of in that blend tank out there? VFAs, right? You're like, hey, bugs that, you've developed this unique metabolism where when there's a lot of VFAs and no oxygen and no nitrate, you're the only guys that can get the VFAs. And then we say, here's 2,000 milligrams per liter of VFA. What do you think they're going to do? Well, they're going to store as much of that in their cells as they possibly can. They're just like, I'm going to go nuts and just make a ton of PHA, because they don't know that they're not going back to aerobic conditions. They don't know that THP is in their future and they're going to get destroyed. They think they're going to go back to aerobic conditions, and then they'll grow with all that VFA that they stored. And as operators, as engineers, we're just fortunate that for energetic reasons, that phosphorus is part of this cycle, right? That they developed a metabolism that utilizes like poly P bonds to store a little bit of energy so that they can facilitate this carbon storage. Right? They're just using the phosphorus as a vehicle for carbon storage. Right? So it's not different necessarily than what we've learned in the past. It's just thinking about it from a little different angle, that they really care about BOD.
So Leon, where are they getting that poly P to begin with?
Over here. So you got to have both. Like you have to. So all right, that's a very deep theoretical question, Paul. Which came first, the poly P or the PHA? Hold on 1 second. What was that? No. They need to have poly P. So poly P is kind of the tool they have that enables them to do the carbon, right? So if you go into let's see, 10 mile. 10 miles completely aerobic right now, right? You don't have any selector zones. You have any of this BNR stuff yet. If you go and do a DNA scan at 10 mile, there are PAOs there. There's just not very many of them, right? They're not a specialized organism, because there's always these little niche environments where you're going anaerobic and aerobic, and that cycling leads to the selection. Now, they do have to have the poly P stored up to be able to do the PHA storage in the anaerobic conditions. And it's just that if there's a small amount of those bacteria present, for whatever reason, like I can't tell you why they evolved this way, they had this phosphorus cycling mechanism in place, right? I mean, we can look at it from an energy standpoint. There is, when you start getting into like the TCA cycle and how phosphorus is a key piece of all of our energetics, like there's reasons like why phosphorus would be the compound that someone evolved to utilize as part of this carbon storage system. But I don't know. That's as far as I can go with it, and why they need the poly P. But what I can tell you is that if you take an aeration basin and you put an anaerobic zone up front and an aerobic zone behind, and there's phosphorus coming in, like this will happen, right? And they're growing using the PHA. I can tell you that as well, because they're heterotrophs. Like PAOs are just heterotrophs with this like special metabolism developed within their cells, right? And so they're growing on this carbon cycling, and again they've evolved to use this poly P component in that cycling. But yeah, whether you have to have the poly P first before the PHA, or you have to store some of the PHA to be able to store up the poly P, I don't know the details of that, poly. It's like blowing my mind right now.
The muscle, if you think about it.
Let's go with that. I like analogies.
And some kind of muscles. Right? I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. It's all about. It's just differences in how they access the carbon. So if there's a heterotroph, right? So under anaerobic conditions, why aren't our normal heterotrophs going after the VFA? Yeah, oxygen or nitrate. They need something to combine because they don't have this storage compound, right? And so that's the competitive advantage of PAOs, is that they're able to do this poly P thing, and no one else can access this VFA. VFA is like the best piece of wastewater. Everybody wants VFA. And so to be able to develop a competitive advantage against all the other bacteria out in the system, that you can get the VFA first, that's why they grow. Right? And having that, Paul is right, having this poly P in their cells is a critical piece of it. If they don't have that cycling, that ability to cycle, they're not going to do it, and they're not going to access that VFA, and they're not going to have a competitive advantage. All right, Russ, is that confused more of the blend tank stuff, or is that gonna get at your question? Okay. Yeah, no, it's like I planted that question just so you'd ask it.
Is this the same process in the plan? Being that we are,
I don't think it has to be long enough HRT, right? Setting your phone.
Hold on, yeah, you're gonna go in the right spot. So you got a blend tank, and you ask, is it the same process?
the VFA, I mean, that, they're the same. Once it hits the blend tank, is that the same?
Yeah. So when you take a non-bio peat sludge and send it into a blend tank,
Yes.
you see BFAs in your blend tank? Yep. Okay. Do you see any of this phosphorus cycling going around? No. Why wouldn't we see it in that case? Because I just told you that if you have a condition where there's a lot of carbon availability, these PAOs are going to try to store the carbon. But we don't see it at 10 mile. Why not? Crystal, what do you?
Could be wrong is because.
No, you're doing good. So what is the majority of your time at work spent thinking about? Well, that's a dangerous question. What unit process? There's one specific one that I've heard you talk a lot about on our calls once a week. Dewatering, right?
The dewatering.
And what does the dewatering do? Like that's removing this that you stick if you stick that biomass inside your blend tank, you make all this VFA, right? But then the actual bacteria that are in there, you dewater and get the heck out of there. If you recycled from that blend tank where they had all this VFA access and sent the solids back to the aeration basins and then back around, now you start getting that cycling. The same thing would happen in your blend tank where you'd grow PAOs that would suck that VFA up and then go back to the aerobic conditions to store that poly P. Yeah, so if you didn't have to waste it all, you could just stop dewatering and just recycle the solids around, you'd have a bio P system. But yeah, it's you're making this condition for your bacteria, but not this one. You have to have both. Yeah, good question though. So we're going to talk about RAS fermentation, and that's kind of the concept of RAS fermentation is what you're kind of thinking down the lines of. So we can set all 3 hours on this figure if you guys want to. But any other?
Well, Leon, kind of a unique thing that we discovered in Gin Creek when we first started the process going down the path of we're going to be a phosphorus removal plant, right? Fortunately, we had 3 years to learn to operate the system to get it efficient. Well, we kept getting really good phosphorus removal coming out of our AVs. Our effluent phosphorus was still high. And it took like a couple of months just looking and thinking about it, a lot of sampling. Realized that our flows were extremely low at that time for the size of the plant. Well, I know Carl remembers this. And so at night, when the flows would really dip off, our holding time and our clarifiers went way up. And we would develop anaerobic conditions
Yep.
in the sludge layer.
Yep.
And we would get this huge phosphorus.
Yeah.
We'd have to store water all through the day so that we could keep it going through the plant during the night. That's when kind of this light bulb went off in my head of, the difference between, really in a simplistic format, ammonia is consumed and it's consumed.
Yeah.
Right? Phosphorus, it can be released at any time under the right condition.
Yeah.
Whether you're running your sludge holding tank decants too long and you go into an anaerobic condition and you're returning all that back to your plant, God forbid your clarifier sits, and then he goes out to it. So
Yeah.
Build off of what John said, to relate that to cruise. So it's kind of like similar, like with our blend tank, when they send their waste to us, even though they got that luxury uptake on their waste, but it's sitting in our blend tank for about a day.
Yeah.
Before we still get that 40% phosphorus release.
That's what this is happening. And I want to build this on, we're going to stay on this figure for a while, because I think this is a really important point that, I wanted to talk about today. So if you've got your final clarifier, like John said, right? How thick of a blanket, like Denton Creek right now, how thick is the blanket? The Mountain Creek.
Or anywhere from like
14 to 36.
14 to 36. So you've got a blanket in here that's somewhere around this. All right. So how about at cruise? How thick are your blankets? Your rectangular clarifier blankets.
We start from 6 feet to finish off between a foot and 2 feet.
Yeah. So the non-cruise people, did everyone hear how thick their blanket is at the head of the basin? 6 feet. Right. So there's 6 feet of blanket up here, and then it tapers off. All right. So John, you said you had low flows. That's when you got release. So why would we see release in this blanket under low flow conditions? Yep. Exactly. And then it starts to ferment. Right. So if biomass, so like when we send so the blend tank here, Crystal said you're sending sludge into your blend tank, and what do you get produced in there? BFA, right? Sludge makes BFA. It's like it's what happens like when we let sludge sit at all. So when we let that sludge sit in this blanket, all right, if it's sitting long enough, right, it can go anaerobic and not have any phosphorus release. It has to be long enough that there's enough BFA stored or produced that they do this PHA storage and phosphorus release. All right, so we've had this historic kind of connectivity to, and Paul brought it up yesterday, and I'm not saying Paul's wrong, that there's a secondary release, right? And that's bad. It's only bad if one of two things happens, right? One, if you never recycle this sludge back around, because your PAOs, like if they're going to release phosphorus, they're releasing it because they're storing PHA. Right? That's when they release phosphorus, because they're not growing on phosphorus. Like it's not the only reason that they would ever break these poly P bonds down is because they're storing more PHA. Right? So if you don't ever recycle them back to aerobic conditions, that phosphorus at release will never get taken back up. So that's one thing. Like it's got to go back to aerobic or you have problems. The other thing that we see in clarifier blankets is that this happens. And do you think that when we have a pile of sludge on the bottom of a clarifier and there's water above it, are those like are they like water and oil, like they don't actually interact at all, or do you think there's some exchange between those two? There's exchange rate, right? And so what's happening is the PAOs are like, oh, I got a little carbon, I'm going to store it here. And it's not that phosphorus can't be taken back up if it's given to aerobic conditions. But what happens, I'm used green for water and blue for sludge, so don't get confused. What happens is that if there's a long enough retention time, and what kind of mechanism do you have at decruise, John?
Towbro.
Does that towbro just like stop moving at night? No, that's still going around, right? So even though you've got a blanket, there's a little bit of like turbidity there, and you can get an exchange of phosphorus up into the liquid. Right, and that's what's bad, because now that phosphorus has been lost. Right, it's not that the phosphorus released in this blanket won't get taken back up. It will be hit by aerobic conditions, because the only reason they release phosphorus is that they're storing PHA. But if it releases in the blanket, it'll exchange with the water, right, and then that goes out the effluent, and that phosphorus is lost. Right, so it's more about releasing in the wrong spot, and then having solids liquid separation that leads to that effluent phosphorus going up. It seems like a nuance, but I think it's an important nuance to really think about it from this carbon storage standpoint and how to manage our PAOs.
Hey, Leon?
Yeah.
Getting in right in the middle of the conversation. So you may have already talked about this, but also
This is only the third slide, Nick, so.
you may start doing some fermentation. That makes some BFAs, but you got a lot of denitrifiers. It's going to go after that and use up those BFAs to denitrify it.
Yeah.
Versus
Yeah.
letting the POs get done.
Excellent point. So, John, what were your nitrate levels? They're going the Wayback Machine. What were your? I have some decreased profiles. The nitrate's like 6 milligrams per liter. So if you can imagine to Mike's point, that 6 milligrams per liter gets consumed pretty quickly, right? Especially if it's sitting for a long time, and then it goes anaerobic. If you're discharging 20 milligrams per liter of nitrate, your blanket's probably never going anaerobic. Right? It might denitrify and like float, but it's not going to go anaerobic. All right, so that's an excellent point, Mike. So let's go back to the cruise blankets that are 6 feet thick. Anybody remember doing profiles out there? Rodell might have still been an operator back when we did some of this stuff. Yeah. Was it? You say you still are, by the way? Just give you a hard
I
time.
heard Steve earlier say, once an operator, always.
I'll get to you.
I'm gonna remind him later on, whenever he tells me just to fix it.
All right, so anybody else remember profiles in the sludge blankets out there? Like actually doing profiles in the depth of the blanket? Did I throw it down? Mike does, Steve does. All right, so I'm gonna put Rodell on the spot in the back of the room. Yeah, so Rodell, what happened to nitrate as you went through the depth of that blanket? It went down, right? So you consume nitrate as you went down. So let's say it was 10 milligrams per liter. You guys aren't going to read that all of it. So let's say 10 milligrams per liter up in the liquid. By the time you get to that bottom of that blanket, it was 0, right? The whole blanket denitrified, right? And we would actually start to see a little bit of phosphorus release in the bottom of that blanket, right? So that blanket's active, right? Think of that. The biology doesn't know they're in a clarifier. Like they think, hey, it's just a anoxic anaerobic zone, and think of it as an extension of your reactors. Now, when you're now at the very bottom of the blanket, we would see some phosphorus release. So let's talk about the mechanism at Cruise. What does that mechanism look like? Anybody that's actually out in running the Cruise clarifiers now, how does the sludge get removed?
Bridge goes back and forth.
It goes back,
Per base.
and where does it suck off of?
Close to the bottom.
Close to the bottom, right? But it's sucking this whole like length, and so there's this little part back here that maybe has a little bit of phosphorus, but we didn't really see a lot. And up here, there's like no solids, and so there would be like 10 milligrams per liter of nitrate. So you get this like mixture of RAS across it. But this is RAS, right? So the only place that phosphorus is released is at the very bottom of this blanket. And where does the RAS get recycled from? The bottom. So if there's phosphorus that's released at the bottom of the blanket, where does the RAS go?
Back to the front.
All right, so what's going to happen to that phosphorus? It's going to get taken back up, right? It's going to have the opportunity to get taken back up. And the likelihood of that phosphorus diffusing through this 6 feet of blanket all the way to the liquid, very, very low. 18 inches, 20 inches, that's going to happen, right? So it's all about the dynamics in your clarifier of the potential negative impacts of your kind of this breakdown of nitrate and phosphorus inside of the blanket. All right, so we're gonna keep on this huge tangent. So how does the recycle at Cruise work? Like, where does the RAS and the primary effluent go? And I want details. I don't just want like the front end. Like, where does it?
Goes into a mixing junction box.
Yeah, so they're backwards now. But imagine you've got your 3 aeration basins, right? And they've got anaerobic zones. So Eric's a much better drawer than I am. There's a chamber right here, and like the RAS comes in here, and the PE comes in here. All right, how quickly does phosphorus release happen at Cruise? And remember profiles that we've taken out in the aeration basin, starting at the mixing basin and even going into this channel that distributes to the aeration basins?
Pretty sure it happened.
It's like instantaneous, right? Like you're at like 15, 16, 17 milligrams per liter of ortho P as soon as that RAS hits the primary effluent, right? This blanket is like priming your PAOs, right? They've actually, they've gone through the aerobic zone and they've depleted all that PHA, right? Which is what we want them to do. Then they sat in this blanket, all the nitrate's getting removed, and they're like, oh, it's anaerobic. Maybe I should start thinking about this PHA storage. And then you send them to this box where it's just like PHA heaven, or not PHA, VFA heaven. And they're just like inundated with it. And they just start cramming VFA into their cells and releasing phosphorus, like in the matter of minutes. Right? So that dynamic is important to think about too, is just how quickly does this stuff happen? As soon as your PHAs are man, I got so many acronyms just bouncing around this morning. As soon as your PAOs are exposed to VFA, they start storing PHA.
Yeah.
Well, we go through that one more time. As soon as the PAOs are exposed to VFA, they start storing PHA. right? It's like boom, boom, boom. That's what they want to do. They want to grab that up as quickly as they can. And as long as they have enough poly P to facilitate that, they'll do it. All right. Ready for slide 4, everybody? What time is it? How long did we take for 3 slides? 45 minutes. I only have 112 today, so we should be at a good pace. Yeah, we'll move faster. But we covered a lot, right? Like we've been talking through it all. We might not get some. We're gonna stop a lot earlier than I thought, but we're gonna go a little bit farther. So just to hit it again, anaerobic conditions. You're enabling that PHA storage. Let's start thinking of our PAOs as what they really are, which is just heterotrophs that cycle carbon and don't do it instantaneously, right? They have a memory. That's another thing we're going to talk about a lot today, is there's a memory to that PHA, right? Imagine if you've got like a week where like you're just exposing them to all kinds of VFA, right? So like Thanksgiving week, right? Anybody else overeat at Thanksgiving? We'll admit that. You're storing all that food, right? And you kind of build up all these resources. I don't know, when I get done with Thanksgiving week, it's like I could not eat for 3 days and I'd be fine, right? That's what they have enough PHA stored. You can turn the VFA off and they'll keep cycling it, right? They'll keep pulling in more phosphorus and breaking down that PHA for an extended period of time. And then you'll see your effluent phosphorus go up. Right, so it's not a boom boom correlation sometimes to phosphorus removal performance, because it's all about this storage product. All right, does the bacteria having a memory make it easier or harder to troubleshoot BIOP? All right, who says easier? You could go do this if you don't want to see who's voting. I got one easier. Come on, someone else thought easier. There's a few more easiers. How about harder? Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's harder, right? Because the thing that's causing the effluent phosphorus to go up may have happened 4 days ago, or maybe it's 2 days ago, or maybe it's today. Like you really have to be thinking about this cycling and saying, oh, well, you know, if all of a sudden I don't quite have enough VFA, but they've stored up a whole bunch of extra PHA, they're going to just keep doing the phosphorus removal, right? And so it may have been 2 days ago that something inhibited the VFA or caused that issue. So this cycling adds to the complexity to troubleshooting as well. So anaerobic conditions, they're storing. Again, aerobic is kind of, you know, breaking down that poly-P. And again, this is where they grow, right? PAOs grow when they oxidize the stored PHA. Now, they don't grow with phosphorus. Phosphorus enables them to grow. I'm just going to keep harping on that today. This is where they grow, is in aerobic conditions. And they're growing with the PHA. They're growing with the stored carbon. All right, so I think what we'll do is we'll do this slide and then we'll take a break unless somebody has some more comments on these ones. So when we start to think about how do we troubleshoot an EVPR facility, right? What can we do to better understand what the biology is actually doing so we can optimize and troubleshoot? Well, we have like 3 questions then. One is, are we achieving PHA storage and phosphorus release? Right? Are we actually, that's a simple one. So when I talk about doing profiles, when we show some other profiles, let's start with the first one. How would you know if you're getting good phosphorus release in your anaerobic zone? Yeah, that's a softball, right? You measure the phosphorus, and if it releases, you release phosphorus. PHA is harder. Like I know 2 labs that can measure PHA, and they're university labs, and they've got grad students, and it's very intensive, right? So the direct measurement of PHA is difficult. But if we're watching like the amount of VFA coming in, the amount leaving, and the amount of phosphorus release that's occurring, hey, you can start to get a sense of like your VFA to P release and kind of track that. The next thing we need to know is our phosphorus uptake happening and PHA breakdown. Again, we can't really measure if that PHA is really being broken down. That's a difficult one. How do we know if we're getting phosphorus uptake? You measure phosphorus, right? And you see like, oh, is it happening really rapidly? Or is it happening across the whole length of the basin? Like, get a sense of the dynamics. If it's happening very quickly, it means you've got plenty of PHA stored, right? And it's enabling them to take that phosphorus up really quickly. If it's extending down the length of the basin, hey, something's wrong. And here's the last one that I want to spend a lot of time on this test. How much extra PHA is available at the end of the aeration basin? Why would we want to know that? What would be the benefit of having extra PHA stored up in your PAOs at the end of your AV?
If we complete the cycle,
Keep going. So you complete the cycle. I want extra PHA. Why do you want extra PHA?
You take a VFA,
Return it.
for the return.
Yeah. Let's think of this PHA as a battery, right? You've got extra energy built up in your cells, so it's not necessarily completing the cycle. Like, you want the poly P to kind of be stored back here. And if you were like a 1-to-1, like using every ounce of VFA that came in to store as PHA in your PAOs, you'd have no PHA left. Now, what happens in that situation, right? If you're using up all of the stored carbon that you had at the end of your aeration basin, and you go to your RAS and you recycle the head of the plant, and your influent VFA concentration drops by 15.
you won't be able to take up VFA, so you could lose a lot of blood. Well,
Yeah, like you're losing.
you don't have capacity to take up more VFA and have that cycle repeat basically.
Having extra PHA means that if we go back to our favorite slide here. So if we have less PHA here when we come back around, right? And there's less VFA coming in, like their delta of PHA storage will go down, right? They'll store less in that new PHA, right? And that's fine, they won't die. But if there's less PHA stored, there's going to be less phosphorus taken up, right? Because they just care about the carbon. The phosphorus is just kind of facilitating it. If they have less of that carbon available, they'll remove less phosphorus. And their effluent phosphorus will go up. Yeah, so if we have extra PHA, I'll keep it on this one. If we have a little extra PHA here, and it comes back around, right? And then we store that same more PHA with the reduced influent VFA, but now our total is still the same. There's a battery there, and it's not completely drained, so that if something weird happens in your influent, well, you've sort of built up a reserve, right? Right. It's nice to have a little bit of extra cushion, so that if something unexpected happens, you can weather the storm. Yeah, they just make life easier, right? Like if you're like constantly feasting, completely famining, right? There's like a balance. Like, is anybody like a famine, like what is it called, feast and famine? Or not? That's not what they call it for the dad. Fasting. Let me do the fasting stuff. I tried it once and I made it 3 hours. That's all I got. Don't laugh at me, Ron Ellie. This guy called me fat yesterday at the beginning of the day. Just to put it out there. Maybe I should be fasting. But anyways, there's a certain amount. There's a certain amount of fasting that's okay, right? Like you do a bit of fasting and it's like, oh, it's healthy, it breaks things down. But if you go to too much, what do you call it if you fast for too long? Starving, right? So it's not as healthy, right? So we want them to be fasting and using some of the PHA, but you don't want them to be starving because they're not as efficient, they're not as healthy. Like we want to have a little bit extra built up just to weather some of the storms that happen in our wastewater influent flows.
Theoretically, if you didn't have any extra capacity for that PHA or extra PHA, would your biology just end up changing more and more as it went on in cycle like this, and they would just lose capacity for the generation ago?
Yeah, exactly. So good question. So this is really important. So if you've got influent wastewater, let's say you're averaging 100 milligrams per liter of VFA, and then it drops to 80 for 3 days. This will help with that. If it drops to 80 for 3 months, this won't help with that, right? It helps you get through like the normal ups and downs. It's not like a trust fund that'll just keep you going forever. Eventually, your PAOs will be like, oh, they'll get to that starving point and then they'll start reducing their fraction of your population. So this is, yeah. So in Wisconsin, and we have a lot of small communities that do biological phosphorus removal. I think that Creek has the risk of this as well, where they have a lot of food processors, right? And you know, so you've got like a cheese plant or sausage factory, cranberry juice manufacturer, and they discharge a lot of really good food Monday through Friday. And then the weekends, they don't produce as much, right? They kind of, you know, they're open all weekend long, but you know, they're not like fully 7 days a week, 24 hours a day operation. And what we'll see is that, you know, BioP can work great. It'll actually work great Tuesday through Saturday and not as well Sunday and Monday. And then when you start having holiday weekends, it keeps getting worse and worse. And so it's got like a day or two where it's like, oh, okay, the VFA shut off a little bit. I built up some extra PHA. We're just going to keep cruising along. But then you get Memorial Day, right? Or you get a 4-day weekend or a shutdown. And over the course of a week, you'll just see the effluent phosphorus just kind of slowly creep up because you're depleting the extra PHA that you stored up the rest of the time. Right. So yeah, 3, 4, 5, 6 days of kind of buffer. But yeah, then you'll start to actually lose PAO activity. They'll start to die off. Like it's not an infinite well, but it is important, right? If you've got a 2 or 3 day buffer, that helps you to weather some of the normal storms that we deal with. All right, so where are we at here? We're at just about 9 o'clock. Let's take the break now because then we're going to talk about